I don't think I can make it to that session. So just make sure my nameplate is removed from it.
I've told them.
Yeah.
What time did it start?
It was supposed to be at 6:30,
6:30.
and I was supposed to finish that and then come here, but he's not.
He has started apparently.
हाँ हो गया?
नीचे ही रख दीजिए अगर हो सकता है because ये फिर
सुनाई दे रहा है? Can you hear me?
yeah.
Okay. So your average day is what? You start at 8, 8:30, 9? Really?
Yeah,
So when you message me in the morning, normally 7:30.
yeah. So that's my first call has already happened by then. The first call with the reporters has already happened by then.
And ends the day at?
End time is usually post 10.
Wow.
Yeah, on a good day.
And more or less when you're in Delhi, it's at the office?
Yeah. It's open the office. I've never done work from home. Is it slipping? No, it's fine. Yeah, I think it's fine. Welcome to the Global Dialogue. I'm Shireen Bhan and we're coming to you live from the CII Global Economic Policy Summit. It is my great pleasure to welcome two very articulate gentlemen on the program. Tom Friedman, author, columnist of the New York Times, and of course international affairs strategist, joins us now live from Washington DC. I'm also joined here by Uday Kotak. 2022 has seen many changes. When the world was just recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a fragile recovery underway, and then we saw the Russia-Ukraine war break out, leading the world into a food and energy crisis. The climate crisis continues to be an issue that we are currently grappling with. There are, of course, other factors to contend with. A much more insular China, veering between a zero-COVID policy to now trying to reopen its borders and its economy. In the midst of all of this, India has been relatively resilient. The Indian economy continues to grow at about 7%, and the expectation is that while inflation is high, it is under much better control than what we are seeing in the rest of the world. So what does the future look like? What will 2023 hold? Joining me now are these two gentlemen. Tom Friedman, always a pleasure. It's good to have you on the air talking to us about what 2022 will end like and what 2023 holds. But you know, I want to quote something for the benefit of our viewers, and this is what you said in Davos earlier this year. You said, when I wrote the world is flat in 2004, Facebook didn't exist. Twitter was still a sound. The cloud was still in the sky. 4G was a parking space, LinkedIn was a prison, applications were what we sent to college, big data was a rap star, and Skype was a typographical error. The world has changed significantly since 2004, and we've seen some fundamental shifts through the course of the pandemic and through 2022. If I were to ask you to look back at the year gone by, we're almost in the last lap of 2022. Mr. Friedman, what would you say have been the biggest surprises, the most unusual developments that will shape the way things will pan out from here on?
Well, Shireen, thank you. It's great to be back with you. Fond memories of our interview with Nandan Nilekani a while ago, my thought friend in Writing the World is Flat. And great to be with my friends at CII. I wish I were in India with you. You know, I guess the way I could sum up how I feel about the world today, Shireen, is that something I wrote when the Ukraine war broke out. I wrote that this is actually the real World War I. Oh, that thing we called World War I back in 1914 or whatever, that actually wasn't a world war. Half the world was colonized back then. And most people were still subsistence farmers. They weren't really touched by it. This, what we're experiencing now, is the actual World War I. 2/3 of the planet has a smartphone now to follow this war, even participate in it by way of opinion. Farmers from the most remote towns in India to Ecuador to Chad have all been touched by this war, by the energy prices and food prices that you alluded to, Shireen, out of this war. So whenever people ask me, hey, you know, Friedman, is the world still flat? It's actually flatter than ever. In fact, it's not just flat, it's fragile. Because what's actually happened is that we've connected more and more nodes on the planet than ever. We've removed a lot of the buffers and we've replaced them with grease. So now instability in any one node gets more easily transmitted to the entire system, where you're talking about a COVID a pandemic or economic or energy contagion. So that's kind of how I see this moment right now. And the countries doing best are those who have developed the internal resilience to manage this flow right now. India's done, under the circumstances, actually, I think, pretty well in that regard.
You know, you talked about resilience, and I would say that if I were to pin down one word that I've heard from every leader through 2022, it is resilience. It's resilience in the context of economies, it's resilience in the context of supply chains, and it's resilience in the context of what you spoke of, globalization. And that's what I want to address with you, because you said that the world is interconnected like never before, and any instability in any part of the world impacts the world disproportionately, and we're seeing that play out even today. What do you then have to say about those who argue that globalization as we know it is dead? Of course, we can argue about the failures of globalization as we know it, but besides trade, the concept of globalization, we're now talking about re-globalization. You know, your thoughts on where we are in this era of re-globalization, onshoring, offshoring, friendshoring. How do you now see it?
So, you know, ever since The World is Flat came out, Shreen, once a year pretty much you could set your clock by it. Somebody wrote a book or an article telling me that the world wasn't flat and globalization was over. If I had a nickel, in fact, for everyone, I'd be a wealthy man today. Get over it. The world is connected because people want to connect, because the technology enables them to connect. People want to connect. Girls just want to have fun, okay? And as a result of that, in fact, well, just think about what we're doing right now. It's as if we're in the same room. Of course, I'm thousands of miles away. People confuse globalization with trade. Guess what? Economists don't own the definition of globalization. So they define globalization as trade and financial flows. If they're up, globalization is alive and well. And if they're down, globalization is over. That's not how I actually defined the term in The World is Flat. What I argued in The World is Flat is globalization is about the ability to act globally. And most importantly, not just as a country, not just as a company, but what was new about what I saw in India was the ability to act globally as an individual now. People can compete, connect, and collaborate individually now on more things in more ways for less money than ever before. That is actually getting more and more enhanced. Now, the financial and trade flows will go up and down. And so you raise the question of reglobalization. There is no question that we are readjusting, we, the United States, our relationship with China now, which was a huge engine of globalization. And there's going to be much, people are bringing supply chains either home or redistributing them. Apple is going from China to India. Apple is going from China to Vietnam. Does that mean globalization is over? No, as you said, it's being reshaped. It will always be reshaping and adapting according to political currents. But the ability to connect, compete, and collaborate globally, that's getting enhanced by the technology more and more, and also, Shereen, by the climate. The climate change is pushing us together through migration closer and closer than ever before.
Yes, Mr. Kotak, I want you to come in on this aspect of globalization. And as Tom Friedman said, you know, trade will come up or trade will go down. What is very clear is that there is a reshaping of equations at this point in time. To look at the world from a geo-economic lens in the context of what's happening with various geopolitical pressures, pain points, friction, as a business leader today, of course, it adds complexity to commercial decisions, to business decisions. But how are you seeing this reshaping, and what will it mean for an economy like ours?
Shireen, I think geopolitics has become a lot more a key factor in economics than ever before. And if you looked at financial markets pre-February 24, 2022, it was a different world. Financial markets generally ignored geopolitics, and post-February 22, it's now center stage. And therefore, we need to look at financial markets, economics in the context of the changing geopolitical order. And it is here that I believe when we look at the world as a whole, there are parts of the world which are much less affected by some of the impact of Russia, Ukraine, and other factors. US, I think, is one of the most self-sufficient countries in the world. It has got its complete military capability. It has financial power with the dollar as the reserve currency. And in addition to that, it is self-sufficient in food and fuel. Therefore, even if things went wrong with the rest of the planet, the United States of America is fine. However, I can't say the same thing about the European continent now. And I think one of the biggest pressure points in the 2022 and beyond is going to be Europe. And many of us from India would love to go to Europe for holidays, but as a business destination, Europe will have to do a lot to come back to center stage. And of course, that brings China. China is a very different situation, and India has its own challenges, and India and US are on the same page from a geopolitical point of view vis-a-vis China. And finally, if you look at the other areas, which is, say, the United Kingdom, at some point of time you got to ask, should we call it the Great Britain or Little England? It's changed, and therefore the whole dynamics of the world as we have known for a long time have changed. And I genuinely believe India has a much greater ability to play a bigger role, and the United States continues to be the dominant force in the world.
You know, many important aspects that you've brought to the table, Mr. Kotak. Let me get Tom Friedman to respond to some of those issues. Let's pick up on Russia. And in one of your recent columns, Mr. Friedman, you talked about a pariah Russia as being a significant geopolitical threat. You also talk about the fact that you believe that Putin is assembling an energy bomb, which you believe he's going to unleash during Christmas. Now, what exactly is the view as far as the Russia-Ukraine war is concerned, the options now before the world, before Putin, before Ukraine, 10 months on, there doesn't seem to be any end in sight?
Yeah, unfortunately, President Putin seems to put himself up a tree, basically, Shireen. He can't win, he can't lose, and he can't stop. That is, it's pretty clear now Russia does not have the military power, literally the armaments, to defeat Ukraine in the sense of occupying the capital and taking over the country. He cannot win in that sense. But politically, Putin can't lose. He can't afford to lose because he has lost somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 killed and wounded in Ukraine. He has lost thousands of tanks and other forms of military equipment. He's expended thousands of rockets and rounds of artillery, and he has very little to show for it. And he can't afford to end the war, therefore, by saying, I took us on this incredibly crazy enterprise, and I got nothing for it. So we're all, Shireen, when a war like this starts, you ask yourself as a columnist, I do, where should I be? Should I be in Kiev, Lviv, Warsaw, Berlin, Brussels, Washington, Moscow? Where should I be as a columnist to cover this properly? Well, there's always only been one place to cover this war from, and that's inside Vladimir Putin's brain, because basically it's all combusting there in his head. And he shared his war plans with very few people. I would defy you to tell me right now, today, 8-9 months into the war, what it's about. What is his goal? Is his goal to occupy Kiev? Is it just to annex part of Russia, about part of Ukraine? To this day, we don't even know what it's about. So when you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. And it seems to me Putin's lost on this road. And my fear is that he's going to turn Russia into a giant North Korea, only with 11 time zones and 5,000 nuclear weapons. My super fear is that he turns Russia into Libya, which is that the place cracks up and you have warlords, taking over different parts of the country with nuclear weapons. So I really fear for this country. Russia is the largest landmass country in the world, and we really don't know what's going to happen there.
Mr. Kotak, in the context of not knowing what's going to happen as far as Russia is concerned, and if this is in fact going to play out to be a protracted war, we've just seen a recent escalation, the impact of that on the energy market, on the food market, on interest rates. While we have relatively done okay so far, the Indian economy, but if this were to be a long, Tom Friedman fears that this could be one of the forever wars, for instance. What then? What happens to global growth? What happens to the Indian economy in that context?
I think, Shireen, markets have found a remarkable way of discounting the future. At times they are wrong as well, as they were wrong in February 22. So the markets are beginning to discount this as a long drawn out war with a view that supply of oil from Russia is a necessity for Russia to fund itself. And there will be different ways through which this supply will continue to happen, and therefore the energy markets will not be starved of this supply. That is the current bet. If you look at the price of oil in the last few weeks, most of us feared winter and assumed that the price of oil will be 120, 130, 140.
It's below 80.
It's below 80. And therefore, one of the things we got to keep in mind is markets have a way of discounting, and if energy is so crucial for Russia and most of Europe continues to be dependent on energy, I would be very surprised if that gets cut off. However, the picture which Tom has presented, that is something which is frightening. And I actually want to ask Tom the question, and we are really trying to get into your brain, Tom. What do you think is the most likely outcome of Russia-Ukraine situation in 2023?
So if I were in your position as a global businessman trying to game this out, I think the most likely, not the most certain, but the most likely outcome is a frozen conflict. More like Turkey and Cyprus, Turkey, Greece, and Cyprus, where neither side surrenders, neither side even agrees to a formal ceasefire. But basically they freeze their forces in place. Russia has taken a bite out of eastern Ukraine, bigger than Crimea. But Zelensky and the Ukrainians have preserved, 4/5 of the country, and we'll just adapt around that. I think that's, I don't predict it, but I think of all the options, that's the most likely. But you do have to assign a possibility that the Russian army fractures in Ukraine, and again, depends on what the Ukrainians are able to do on the ground during winter. But that's still a live possibility. And it may be a 1 in 10 chance, but once that happens, then you introduce the prospect or possibility of nuclear weapons. Because I think the two conditions under which Vladimir Putin would consider deploying a nuclear weapon. One is if he runs out of other weapons and his army is on the run. And the other, if he sees himself losing Crimea. I think for him, Crimea is an absolute nuclear red line that he can't afford to lose Crimea. So we still have a very unstable situation.
A very unstable situation, and we don't even want to go down the road of thinking about the use of nuclear weapons. It is just too horrific a thought to consider at this point in time. But let me move the conversation away from Russia and Ukraine and address the other issue, and that is the issue of China. In one of your columns, you said that if you had to put down for 2022, the most significant development that the world has seen, that would be Czechsit. And you talked about what's happening with China, making a break from what it's been on the journey over the last 4 decades of trying to integrate with the world, integrate much more with the West, and now move much more insular. In light of what we've seen happen in the last few days with the public protests, unusual for China, with China now having to say and acknowledge that, look, we're reopening, zero COVID might still be a thing on paper, but clearly they're moving away from that. How do you see China playing itself out, not just domestically, but also with the world in 2023?
Well, Shireen, what's going on in China is a giant development, and I know Mr. Corder would agree. Basically, I see U.S.-China relations between 1979 and 2019 as an epic. Those 40 years. It was an epic of unconscious integration. We became deeply integrated economically and even socially with China. American China over those 40 years became the real one country, two systems, not China, Hong Kong, or certainly one economy, two systems. And that is not, and that drove so much of globalization, and it helped bring hundreds of millions of people out of abject poverty in China and in India and around the world. That 4-decade period is over. Well, maybe it's just temporarily over. Maybe it's permanently over. But when you think about what President Xi Jinping has done, China today is so much more open, Shreen, than it was 40 years ago, and it's so much more closed than it was 10 years ago. China's made a U-turn backwards, and it's having huge implications for China, and it's having huge implications for the world. That if you talk to major American multinationals, their basic approach when it comes to supply chains, when it comes to China, is what they call ABC, anywhere but China. Anywhere but China. That doesn't mean they're going to pull out their relationships in China, that they're going to uproot their supply chains there. But if I'm going to add somewhere now, my instinct as a multinational is not to double down in China. And you see that with Apple announcing how they're going to reduce their footprint there. That is long run really problematic for China. And that's a product of things that I think, mistakes that President Xi Jinping has made. And so, we live in a world today where to make anything complex, semiconductors, for instance, I'm going to pluck a hair from my head, Shireen. You can't see it all the way here to Washington, but this hair I'm holding in my finger is actually 80,000 nanometers. Okay, we're making microchips now with transistors that are 5 nanometers, 7 nanometers. In order to do that, the physics of doing that, the industrial physics of doing that, require a global supply chain. It requires German lenses, Dutch lithography, Japanese gases, American design tools. It's a global supply chain. And more things, that is true, making more and more sophisticated products. Now, when China cuts itself off from the world this way, what it's basically saying, to put it in basketball terms, is that the Chinese national basketball team is going to play the global Olympic All-Stars forever. Well, good luck with that. I think it's a huge mistake, and it will have huge implications.
Well, speaking of the implications, Mr. Kotak, and just to pick up what we heard there from Tom Friedman, that multinationals are now thinking anywhere but China and will look for alternatives to set up manufacturing bases to sort of do business. And one of the alternatives is likely to be India. He brought up the example of the semiconductor industry. India has rolled out a policy to set up semiconductor facilities here. The US has doubled down on that commitment. They've passed 2 legislations and put more money on the table to ensure that there is domestic manufacturing. What will be the global implications in the near term, in the medium term and the long term of a much more insular approach from China?
See, there was a time when many of us in India felt that India has missed the bus in manufacturing and we should be focused on services. This China opening and the issues which China is facing actually bring back the opportunity for India to get a reasonable share of global manufacturing capability. And this is something which we must grab at all costs. We in India really need to focus on making the ease of doing business, making things simple, getting this China +1 or China +2 as our strategy. I think Tom mentioned about Vietnam. It's a small little country compared to India. Why is it that they are getting such a lot of share? India should be out there and getting a lot more, and this is where I believe we really need to work as business and government to go all out and woo global manufacturing for alternatives beyond China. And I think it requires a very significant change in our mindsets, in our laws, in our practices to really get this unique opportunity of getting manufacturing back in India. We are at 16% of our GDP as manufacturing. We should be at 20 and above. And this is our opportunity because some other country which dominated the world manufacturing is actually not doing a good job. But against that, we also got to keep in mind the point which we started with, which is resilience and what is a principle of self-reliance. Most countries are moving to saying that we want a basic level of ability to support our economy in our geography. So some of this will go back home in the respective countries and respective manufacturing. But there is still a share which will come beyond their home markets in terms of development. And we must get more than a fair share of this. And for that, India needs to be competitive. We need to figure out what we can do to really use this opportunity to fill our $120 billion a year gap on current account. unique opportunity to dramatically up our game.
You know, since you're talking about upping the game, and you also talked about the fact that we will likely see a reshaping of equations. Janet Yellen was here in India and she talked about friend-shoring. Let me ask you that, Tom Friedman. You know, bilateral agreements, trade agreements between countries like India and the US, doubling down on investments between the two countries, the government sort of bolstering the efforts, giving more momentum to further deepen this relationship. How much of that do you see playing itself out in the context of what's happening in China in 2023?
Yeah, I mean, I so agree with what Mr. Cordes said, that this is a great opportunity for India. It's a multi-sectarian democracy. It has its flaws, just like America has its flaws, but it's basically tilted in the right direction. I think what's missing is that plug to plug efficiently into the global economy. And that's about infrastructure, it's about regulations that make it a really easy decision to flow investment opportunities into India and to flow profits out. And I don't know specifically, where the issues are, where the roadblocks, but I would entirely agree with Mr. Cordes that business and government in India should be sitting down, putting their heads together, have a 1 year, 2 year plan for how to really take advantage of this very plastic moment, the first in 40 years, where many companies around the world are saying now anywhere but China, and that those flows they will go to the most efficient and profitable places, and they'll go to Vietnam, they'll go to Malaysia, and India should be looking to claim its share. I don't say this in hostility to China. If China were opening up and on the path that it was on a trajectory to more and more sort of economic reform, I would certainly be encouraging that. But that's not the path they're on. And when a country like China, it's a giant super tanker, changes direction like that, it creates a lot of waves and opens a lot of opportunities for others.
Mr. Kotak, speaking about opening up opportunities, and you talked about that this is the moment that India must seize and not lose out on this opportunity. Now, what's left? For instance, from the tax point of view, in terms of competitiveness, we have brought corporate taxes down quite significantly. If you want to set up a new manufacturing unit, the timeline for that has also been granted an extension. There have been changes made to improve the ease of doing business. Where do you believe more work needs to be done to inspire confidence and to draw in the foreign direct investment?
I think India has made a lot of progress in many areas, but there are still a few which we can get better at. Number one, the challenges between the center and the states. So the center is extremely welcoming. A lot of companies come down to India and then decide to set up their plants in different parts of the country. But the integration between the center and states in terms of one single policy to make it easy is important, and we need to really focus on it. Second, we need to be able to treat global and domestic investors and corporates similarly. Global corporations should not be feeling that there is a not equal treatment between a domestic player versus a global corporation setting up facility in this country. A level playing field in terms of how process goes is very crucial for a global corporation to feel comfortable coming on its own. And we need to analyze that wherever global corporations, for whatever reasons, have had a difficult experience in India, and we have got examples of Docomo, we've got example of Vodafone, we've got examples in other sectors as well. We need to go deep and ask ourselves, what were the things we could have done better as a country not to have reached where we did.
Tom Friedman, let me move this away from India and talk about the US. Mr. Kotak right at the start talked about how he believes that the US will also be relatively unscathed even if this continues to be a prolonged war between Russia and Ukraine. But I want to get your thoughts on where the US is headed, especially in the context of what we've seen happen with the midterm elections. It was a surprising result in favor of the Democrats, and more importantly, in the run-up to the 2024 elections. What are your bets?
Well, I wouldn't make, it's a little too early, Shreen, to make any bets right now, but I really want to stress for my friends in India that how surprising the midterms were. And it's not simply that the Democrats did better in this midterm than they have, I think, going back to the Kennedy days. Um, uh, it's actually something deeper. This was a example of democracy healing democracy. Okay, what do I mean by that? Um, Thanks to Donald Trump's big lie, there were candidates on the ballot for governor, for secretaries of state in individual states, for Senate and Congress, whose main campaign was based on a big lie that the 2020 election was stolen from Donald Trump. People ran for office on that and promised that they would use their office to interfere in our next election, possibly. And what happened was actually made this the most remarkable midterm, certainly the most important midterm, probably in modern American history. American voters, principled Republicans, principled Democrats, principled independents, went into the voting booth. They identified every election denier, whether they were running for governor or senator or Congress or mayor, basically, and they voted against them. And virtually, not all, but virtually everyone was defeated, from Arizona to Nevada, all the way across to the East Coast. It was a remarkable engagement of civic energy in a democracy from the bottom up. No one predicted it. We've never seen anything like this. People split their tickets. They were Republicans. They liked the guy running for Republican for governor, like in Georgia, and they voted out the Republican who was an election denier for the Senate or Secretary of State. We saw it in Pennsylvania. We saw it in Michigan. It was Arizona. It was remarkable, and it's something that gives me is a source of pride. I think should be for every American. It gives me a lot of hope. We have to remember, though, how close this was. Sometimes people won by 10,000 votes. Okay, so it was a close run thing, but it was a remarkable assertion of citizens using democracy to cure and save democracy. Very important.
Yes, very important indeed. But Tom Friedman, you said it's too early to place bets yet, but Donald Trump, do you believe that he's likely to run, given the way that the results have panned out?
Well, Trump's already announced that he's running.
Yes.
I think what you're really saying, does he have a chance to win?
Yeah.
First, the Republican nomination, and then the actual presidency. Look, one should never rule out Donald Trump. He's proven to be extremely resilient. But basically, Trump has visited electoral disaster on his party now in 3 straight elections. The previous midterm, then the last in 2018, the 2020 election, now the 2022 election. Republican candidates have lost all 3 at a time when they were not up against strong Democratic candidates. So you can see in the papers this morning, many Republicans now openly grumbling, we need an alternative, but it's going to take someone to step out. So Trump still has his hardcore 30% of Republican votes. No other Republican is close to that in terms of that hardcore 35% that he has. So he could conceivably win renomination by going through the primaries and just defeating everyone with a plurality while all the others split their vote. So it's going to take someone to actually step up against him and step out. It's hard for me to express how weak-kneed, how spineless the Republican Party has been. And so we really are here waiting, hoping, praying that some Republican actually grows a spine. And that's a hard thing to do, we know from biology, but and actually takes Donald Trump on the way Liz Cheney was ready to do. But it's going to take you cannot beat something with nothing. And right now the Republicans have nothing. And so a very flawed Donald Trump, who's visited 3 straight electoral defeats on them, is still, if you're betting, you have to bet on him, at least to be the Republican candidate.
Yes, well, that's what it seems like at this point in time. Mr. Kotak, end of 2022, as we start 2023, the possibility of recession in at least large parts of the developed world. What's the outlook that you have as far as global growth is concerned? And what are you going to be watchful of?
I think global growth, we really got to see first what happens to the United States and where does the Federal Reserve end in terms of interest rates. I think Europe itself right now is looking very weak with high inflation, and I think a possible recession already on the cards. Therefore, India, from an Indian point of view, I think this is a great opportunity. While we'll have a slower growth on exports, I think the domestic economy is still chugging along. As you said, we will do 7% for this fiscal year ending March 23, and I would like to hope that we do at least 6 plus next year. We will have challenges. I think we have also got to watch what happens to China and what China does with its COVID policy and how it takes it forward. So in my view, I think America has a good chance of a reasonable possibility of a soft landing. Europe, I'm not sure. China depends on how they handle the post-COVID world, and does the President Xi make a move to really get back economic growth in China. From the point of view of financial markets, markets are probably having a view that the Chinese markets are very cheap and this is a good time to take a tactical bet on China. But from a strategic point of view, I think most investors globally believe the strategic opportunity is certainly much more in India. Therefore, India will get a higher share of global capital, though Indian valuations are reasonably rich. I am actually a believer that this is India's game to lose. We have to do things right on our side, and if we do it, this game is ours to take a bigger share of the global economy going forward.
Well, that seems to be the consensus at this point in time. Tom Friedman, I'm going to give you the final say. You know, we've talked about many of the red flags, the challenges that the world continued to see through 2022. Any other flashpoints or red flags that you're going to be mindful of as we get into 2023? Do you believe that it's going to be worse than 2022, the year ahead?
You know, I wouldn't make any predictions, Shireen. It's just too many imponderables. But I want to pick up with what Mr. Kartik said, which I think it's a year of great opportunity for India if it gets its basics right, continues to build good, solid infrastructure, both physical and regulatory. If it preserves its pluralism, India's pluralism has always been, I think, it's a great strength. And source of attraction for the world. I think that's very important. It has a lot of political stability right now under Prime Minister Modi, and it has a very dynamic business community. And so if India simply plays to its strengths, keeps its eyes on its knitting, this is, I think, not just a year, but a time of great opportunity.
Well, Tom Friedman, Uday Kotak, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Global Dialogue to share with us your view on the year gone by and, more importantly, the year ahead. It's an absolute pleasure. And Tom, we look forward to seeing you here in India, perhaps in 2023.
I'm eager to get back.
Well, thanks very much. On that note, it is time for us to wrap up this special edition of the Global Dialogue. We'll take a break. There's a lot more coming up. Don't go anywhere. We're back in a moment.